requires financial institutions, and for that matter, non-financial public corporations, to report their financial conditions on a regular and timely basis. Right? So publicly owned corporations generally have to file their income statement and balance sheet with the Securities and Exchange Commission once a quarter. Right? So we have all of those kinds of things. In addition, those financial statements must be submitted in generally acceptable accounting format. Right? So if you're looking at a whole bunch of different kinds of banks, the format should be pretty similar. But a bank's balance sheet is not going to look like a metal fabricator's balance sheet. But we want all metal fabricator balance sheets to look broadly the same. Right? So our GAAP accounting helps to provide for that. So we can see exactly what's going on. Now remember, most of us have bank accounts, I'm assuming, which means we have some exposure to the financial condition of the bank. And I'm going to guess absolutely none of us know what that financial condition of the bank is. Right? We just don't know. Banks are very, very complex organizations, and unless you're an accountant that looks at bank balance sheets, you probably do not understand all the risks that are involved. But the bankers know. Okay. Now, the other thing that can happen, and this is especially true for the risk that depositors have with financial institutions, is that they can create a safety net, which we call deposit insurance. Right? So this is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation's fund. It's an insurance fund. The banks pay a premium into it, and this helps to insure deposits in the United States. I think it's up to $250,000. Right? That has several positive aspects to it. Right? One is, if I don't have to worry about the bank failing, because even though they provided me all these financial statements, most of us can't understand them anyway. So if I know that they're not going to fail, or at least if it does fail, I'm not going to lose my money, I'm more willing to put my money into a financial institution. So that part's important. The second thing is, when one bank fails, I don't necessarily have to worry about the next bank failing. That is a contagion effect, because my money is safe. So we don't have these bank runs that we talked about on Tuesday much anymore. They occur on a really, really tiny scale nowadays. So deposit insurance gives us both of those types of benefits. However, deposit insurance also creates some moral hazard. Remember, if you didn't have deposit insurance, the bank executives, if they took additional risks, they were taking risks that would impact all of their depositors. But once you institute deposit insurance, when they take risks, you're not impacting the depositors at all. So if you're not worried about your depositors' risk, then am I, as a bank executive, more likely to undertake risk on the asset side? Higher leverage ratio, riskier assets that presumably have a higher rate of return. All of that would give me a greater ROE and make sure that my compensation would shame almost anybody. Right? So that's again that trade-off here, that banks will take more risks once deposit insurance is in place than they would have before then. How do we trade off those costs and those benefits? Let me give you another example of moral hazard that occurs. So we have this thing called too big to fail, which, as I mentioned, should really be called too big to let fail. But we have to think about what this all means. So in the early part of 2008, it was very clear that many large financial institutions, which owned a lot of these mortgage-backed securities that the rating agencies told them were AAA and AA and single A and so on, that turned out to be mostly garbage. And therefore the assets were beginning to disappear. A solvency crisis was beginning to emerge. So the weakest bank investment bank at that particular point was Bear Stearns. And so the government was very concerned about what would happen if Bear Stearns failed. So they came in one weekend in March of 2008, and the Federal Reserve and the Treasury brokered a deal with J.P. Morgan Chase Bank for J.P. Morgan Chase to take over Bear Stearns, which they did. So think about what that means. Suppose you're now the senior executive at Lehman Brothers. So the government's just rescued an investment bank that looks a lot like us. Well, if they're going to rescue one, aren't they going to rescue the next one that may get into trouble? And if they're rescuing one, why do I need to do anything between now and whenever to make my bank less risky, to get rid of those bad assets, to try and get my house in order? And even though the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, and the Treasury Secretary, Paulson, would go out and say, we're not going to rescue any more investment banks or other large institutions, nobody believed him. And then on September 15th of 2008, they let Lehman Brothers fail. And it was sort of, wait a minute. You generated moral hazard by bailing out Bear Stearns. Everybody thought that they'd bail out whoever was next. They didn't. Right? Now all of a sudden the moral hazard got squished, and now all of a sudden you have contagion effects all over the place and a big economic and financial crisis. Right? So one has to be careful with moral hazard, that once you start doing something that looks like moral hazard, or people believe that it's moral hazard, then it's really hard to pull the rug out from underneath them without very, very severe consequences. Now, because banks are inherently risky, both in terms of their leverage ratio as well as the assets that they have on the balance sheet or the asset liability mix that they have, the government has also decided to regulate banks more heavily than other institutions. And this is in part because there is deposit insurance. If the government is going to provide insurance for banks, then the government feels like it should have the ability, at least within some limited scope, to tell banks how they can behave or not behave. So one of the things that the government does is that they limit the leverage ratio of banks. Right? This reduces some of the risk. It creates a larger equity capital cushion relative to those assets. It also tells banks that you cannot buy certain types of assets that are deemed to be too risky. You also, by the way, cannot fund yourself with certain types of liabilities because they're also viewed as too risky, although that has been less successful in this era of financial engineering. Right? So banks can only do certain kinds of things. So their activities have been subscribed, and risk levels have been reduced as well. Banks are strongly encouraged, to diversify their assets. And this is not just a diversification across an asset category, like real estate. You might have single-family mortgages and condo mortgages. You may have a mortgage on an apartment building, a commercial building, office buildings, hospitals, right? We want some diversification in the types of real estate that we own. But the regulators are also looking for diversification geographically. We don't want a bank to have a well-diversified portfolio of assets, all of which are located within 100 yards of the San Andreas Fault. Right? Big earthquake, everything goes. Doesn't matter how well-diversified you are. So why don't you own some assets that are also in Nevada or Utah or Kansas or Florida or someplace else? Right? We want to continue to promote regular and timely release of financial information so that other individuals and analysts can actually see, at least at that point in time, what your financial condition looks like. And then finally, they also say you need a certain amount of capital, equity capital. Now, many of us who have looked at the financial crisis would recommend that banks hold a lot more equity capital, something that's not likely to happen, both because the banks don't want it to happen and because the government's chicken. But the banks are very powerful in their lobbying effects, and we will see another financial crisis in our lifetime, so it won't be 70 years between them. Now, the final thing that needs to be done, if you're going to have a bunch of rules and regulations, that's great. But the other thing you have to realize is you better check up to make sure these financial institutions are actually following the rules and regulations. Having a rule doesn't do any good if you're not looking over their shoulder to make sure they're following the rules. Remember, all of these rules and regulations actually reduce the profitability of an institution. So since most businesses want to maximize their profits, they're going to try and find all the seams between the rules and regulations. And that's where prudential supervision comes in. You have to keep an eye on the financial institutions to make sure they're following the rules and regulations. Well, this is, between Tuesday and today, this has been just a very brief overview of the financial system. As I mentioned last time, the financial system is incredibly complex, and this is just about as simple as I can make it, although it may not be all that simple. So, as you know, shifting topics. Oh, one other thing before we go on. There was a young lady who asked a question last time about should the government provide deposit insurance. Is that you? Okay, good. At least you sat in about the same seat. Okay, so I don't know your name, but she asked a question about does the government need to offer deposit insurance? The answer to that is actually no. The deposit insurance could be offered by the private sector. Right? You can have just an insurance company or set up an insurance fund where the banks pay into it, they manage the fund just like any other insurance company. Okay? The downside to that is what happens if the insurance company gets into trouble? What's then the backstop to that? We don't want the banking system to all of a sudden implode because nobody has confidence in the deposit scheme. So basically, the only institution that kind of has unlimited resources is the federal government or the national government, the folks that have the ability to print money. Right? So while it's possible, it's probably not very likely. Okay, let's talk about the exam. Okay, first and foremost, all the details that hopefully you already know. By the way, I will post all of these on B courses before I leave the university this evening. Okay? So our exam will be here on Tuesday, November 4th, right, in class. The coverage will be what we've done since the exam 1. So that includes chapters 8 through 12, the appendix to chapter 5, and chapter 14 on the financial system. Right? So it's only going to look at the stuff that we've done since our first exam. The exam is not cumulative, although as you've probably figured out, you still need to remember some of the things that we've talked about before. But I won't have any specific questions about solo growth models, saving and investment, production functions, quantity theory of money, those kinds of things. As all my exams are, this will be closed book and closed notes. No electronic devices are permitted with the exception of language translators, which I must approve before the exam begins. If you come with an electronic language translator, line up here in front, have it turned on. If there's a memory area for a chip or something, open that up so that I can see right away that it's empty. If you're going to use a paper dictionary translator, bring that up as well so that I can see that so when we are walking around, we're not confusing that with some sort of notes that you might have. The exam packet, as you're already aware, is completely self-contained. It's 14 pages, 7 pages double-sided. It has 2 blank sheets on the back. Well, they're not totally blank, right? It says this page intentionally left blank, so you know it didn't go through the copy machine without printing something on there. So that's what it's there for. That is your scratch paper. If you want to rip off the last sheet, that's fine. If you mess up your diagram and you want to redraw it, this is a great place to redraw it. If you need more room to write your answers, which your GSIs hope you don't need more room, then that's the place to write it. Right? So that's what those sheets of paper are for. You'll need your set of colored pens and pencils. Again, black, red, blue, green. A yellow, not an orange, not a green, not a blue, not a purple. A yellow highlighter. If you want to use an eraser, white out, straight edges, those things are okay. Right? Now, I know I said this before, and I'll say it multiple times more. Time management is often the biggest challenge that students have with the exam. Right? Time management. Remember, there's 3 parts to the exam. There's 10 multiple choice questions worth 30 points, 2 free response questions, each of which are worth 35 points. So you have 3 sections to the exam that are approximately the same number of points. You should not be spending a disproportionate amount of your time on any one of those 3 sections. If after the first hour you're still trying to do one of those 3 sections, you haven't managed your time well. Remember, there is diminishing marginal utility as well as diminishing marginal points to continuing to flog a question. If you can't get it down, just move on. If push comes to shove, one thing to remember, you can attempt 30 points worth of multiple choice questions in 1 minute. I don't recommend that, but it can be done. So don't spend a lot of time on the multiple choice questions and run out of time on the analytical questions. If you're going to run out of time on one of the sections, run out on the multiple choice questions and then circle C all the time, right? Don't pick and choose. Now remember, when you look at the answers, I rank the answers from shortest to longest. There's no magic to the way the answers are put in, right? So don't look at, sometimes there literally is no pattern. I'm not looking for the pattern. I don't change the answers after I see a pattern. So it's perfectly possible that the correct answer for all 10 of them could be A or C. Probably won't be, but it's possible, right? So if you're just going to guess on the multiple choice, pick a letter that you like. What's the first letter of your name? Change it to A, B, C, D, or E, and then be very consistent with that. Okay. Now, the second biggest mistake besides time management that students make is they read the question and they miss a key point. Right? They either miss a shock that happens, or they miss that we were not in general equilibrium to start with, or they misinterpret shock as being positive as opposed to negative. Right? Slow down. Take a deep breath. Read the question carefully. Take out your yellow highlighter. On part A, highlight the things that tell you where we begin. Draw your diagram. Take your time. Draw your diagram carefully the first time. The biggest waste of time is having made a mistake on your diagram and having to redraw it. So slow down, get the diagram down right. Then when you move to the second and third parts of the question, take your highlighter, highlight the shocks that occur, all of the shocks that occur. Right? That's the way you want to approach those questions. On the multiple choice questions, use your highlighter. Figure out what the important points of the statement are before you even think about moving to what the various answers are. We're going to look at some multiple choice questions in a few minutes, and I'll show you some of the things that I think you ought to be paying attention to in those particular questions. In your analytical questions, be succinct. We're not looking for a core dump. I'm not asking for everything that you know. I am looking for you to answer the question that's being asked. Answer it very, very directly. Use bullet points. Use bullet points. You don't have to write long, long prose. Use bullet points. Use mnemonics where they are. Remember, though, you need to use English when you talk about what happened and why it happened. Right? Those are the keys, what and why. But if you use bullet points, this happens first, this happens next, this happens next, you'll be very advantageous. Your mnemonics can include arrows up and down, right? AD, shifts, left or right. Use an arrow. Do not spell out aggregate demand. Right? AD will work. We know what it means. Right? Now, of course, if we were up at the gym, we think it meant athletic director, but we know better. We're not there. Right? Okay, so keep that in mind. Write legibly. I know all of your mothers love you dearly, and they tell you that you have great handwriting. I've talked to the GSIs. I've looked at some of your written answers, and let me tell you, we love you dearly too. Some of you don't have great handwriting. In fact, some of you have terrible handwriting. I know it's always a comparison, right? And I can make that comparison because I have terrible handwriting. So if your handwriting looks like my handwriting, you need to slow down and write more legibly. If we can't read it, we can't grade it. Okay? Keep that in mind. At the end of the exam, at 5 o'clock, when I call stop, you will stop. Last time we had some students who did not stop. There is now a 10-point, which is 10% penalty, if we pick up your exam and you are still writing after the exam has officially ended. You cannot get down 10 points from the time that I call time and ask you to pass your exams in until we pick it up. Do not risk it. If you do, the penalty will be 25 points on the final. Okay? I'm looking for where the marginal cost is significantly above the marginal benefit. Okay? I think 10% of your exam should be enough. Okay? Don't risk it. Okay, keep in mind, we only have 2 models this go around. So on exam 1, we had 3 models, 3 very different models: production functions, saving investment, and solo growth models. And while they were all related, you really had to think very differently about those models. This time you don't. Right? Our 2 models are really closely related. In fact, we have our IS, MP, and aggregate supply and demand model, and then we have our aggregate supply and demand model. It's not any different. It's only that we're looking at one of the diagrams rather than all 3 of the diagrams. I'll tell you now, one of your questions will use all 3 diagrams. Guess what the other question will involve? Just a single diagram, right? So you know what to do. Make sure when you're studying you know how the models work. It's very important to know how those models work. Why is this curve upward sloping? Why is this one downward sloping? What causes this to shift? After it shifts, what's going to happen? Right? Those are the kinds of things that you need to be focusing on. Okay, diagrams are great. No, it does not have to be a perfect diagram. You don't need to spend lots and lots of time. Get your diagram, draw it accurately, but also draw it somewhat quickly. Right? Spend it, if you're going to spend a lot of time, spend it on the explanation. Or better yet, spend it on thinking about the explanation. So you can write it down in as few words, bullet pointed, as possible. Right? Remember, one of the things that's key, what's happening, why is it happening? Right? That's where your explanations are going to focus on. It's important. There are many more points on the explanation than there are on the diagram. It's generally 2 to 1. If it's not 2 to 1, it's closer to 3 to 1. Right? I'm assuming that most of you know how to draw the diagrams. So I don't put a lot of points necessarily on the diagrams. Doesn't mean you don't want to draw them or draw them well, because if you can draw the diagrams well, now you've got the story that you need to tell. So remember, it doesn't have to be, this isn't architecture or mechanical drawing where everything has to be very, very precise. It has to be accurate, but it doesn't have to be necessarily precise. What and why? Those are the things you want to concentrate on. Keep in mind your exogenous and your endogenous variables. Endogenous and exogenous variables. Right? So we're going to go through the exogenous variables here in just a minute. And then somebody remind me to talk about the endogenous variables. Okay, so here's our models. Right? IS, MP, aggregate supply and demand. So we have an IS curve. Right? The IS curve is the inverse relationship between the real interest rate and the level of economic output. Right? Economic output depends upon the real interest rate. The steepness of the curve tells us how planned expenditures, economic output, how sensitive that is to the real interest rate. The more sensitive economic output is to changes in the real interest rate would tell us what about the IS curve? Steeper or flatter? More sensitive. So for any given change in interest rates, we would have a bigger change in economic output. So the IS curve would be flatter. Okay, what can shift the IS curve? Okay. Autonomous consumption.